Hey guys, how's it going? Today I'm going to be reviewing the album Long Season by the band Fishmans. This was Fishmans' sixth album, released in October 1996. Fishmans was a pretty unknown Japanese band that was active in the 90s. While they were active, they didn't achieve much success or recognition, but in the past decade or so, this band, and especially this album, have garnered a pretty strong cult following on the internet. Personally, I think this is a great, very unique sounding album, and today I'm going to talk about what makes it so good. So this album is actually just one single 35-minute track. The track has 5 distinct parts, but each part flows seamlessly into the next. I'll put the timestamps for where each part starts in the description so you guys can keep track of that. This album came about from a single that Fishmans released earlier in 1996, simply called Season. They took the ideas that were present on Season and expanded on them to create this album called Long Season. The sound of this album is very unique and ahead of its time for 1996. It's sort of a mix of dream pop, Neo-Psychedelia, and ambient pop. The album is built on a few core melodies that are repeated throughout, including a hypnotizing piano loop that's present in the first and second part, as well as the last part. The melodies in this album are very well written, and they're part of what makes this album so engaging. This album also has a very unique atmosphere. It's very warm and peaceful, and has a sort of ethereal and surreal quality about it. It almost feels like you're transported to another world as you're listening to this album. Part of the reason for this is the lead singer's voice. He has a very distinct, high-pitched voice that's very soothing on the ears and fits this type of music perfectly. All of the instruments that are used on the album, such as the violin, accordion, and keyboard, also give the album a very lush atmosphere. So let me talk through each part of the album and what it sounds like. Part 1 opens with an instantly likable bass groove. Soon after, the piano loop I mentioned earlier faintly creeps in, as well as the guitar. A little while after that, the vocals come in. And finally, the drums and the violin. There's even a children's chorus towards the end of Part 1. The core melodies that are present throughout the album are introduced here. Part 2 sounds fairly similar to Part 1. It continues a lot of the same melodies from Part 1, and it kind of just pulls you into the album more. There's some very passionate female vocals at the end of Part 2 that are vaguely reminiscent of The Great Gig in the Sky from Pink Floyd. Little flourishes like these vocals here, or the children's chorus I mentioned earlier, really help this album to excel. Part 3 is definitely the most experimental part of the album. It's a lot more ambient than the first 2 parts. There's a splashing sound effect that's repeated throughout this part. There's also lots of different experimental sounds added. They also add wind chimes in this part, and there's a pretty explosive drum solo towards the end. It almost sounds like they applied distortion to this drum solo, which results in a very cool sound effect. This is definitely the part of the album that's hardest to get into and could turn you away. It certainly had a warm-up to me, and while it's still my least favorite part of the album, I definitely appreciate the interesting experimentation here. Part 4 of the album is pretty simple. It's mostly just the dream poppy riff with a vocal melody that's repeated over it. It's pretty pleasant sounding and pretty nice on the ears. The atmosphere in this part stays pretty thick as there's some ambient noise added, and there's a lot of reverb that's applied to the guitar. And Part 5 brings back a lot of the motifs that were introduced in Parts 1 and 2 and serves as an excellent finale to the album. It just does a really good job of sort of bringing everything back full circle. Overall, this album is a truly unique experience that deserves to be heard by more people. It has such a relaxing and almost otherworldly atmosphere. All of the layers in the album, the guitar, drums, bass, violins, accordion, all the sound effects work together to create this atmosphere. The melodies are extremely engaging, and having the album be just one track sort of adds to the epicness of it all. This album could be slightly difficult to get into. I can see the Japanese language being a bit of a language barrier for non-Japanese speakers, and as I mentioned earlier, Part 2 is a bit of an acquired listen, but I think everyone should give this album a shot, because if it clicks for you, it's really like no other album out there. Having said all that, I would give this album an 8.6 out of 10. I sort of think it's an overlooked gem, honestly, and it would be great to see it get more exposure. As a side note, Fishmans also have a live album where they play Long Season in its entirety. The album is called 981228 Otokotachi no Wakare. And as much as I like the studio version, I think the live version is better and honestly a 10 out of 10 in my book. So be sure to check that version out as well. Well guys, thank you very much for watching, and if you have heard Long Season, let me know what you think about it in the comments. If you want to see more reviews like this, go ahead and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys later.